Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robert, for this very generous introduction. And I actually came across a publication of CAPAS by complete accident. I was thrilled to see the kind of connections that clearly exist between my work and then what you're interested in. So I'm really thrilled to be here and look forward to connecting with you and exchanging ideas. I should say that the essay I'm going to talk about has been in print like for 5 days. It's coming out in environmental philosophy. It's available online only at the moment, but it will be available in a published version very shortly. But I'm pretty sure that nobody's read it yet, so I think it's still okay. Okay, so without further ado, let me just start here. Davi Kopenawa and Bruce Albert's 2010 collaborative work, The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman, centers on a prophetic warning of impending apocalyptic collapse due to anthropogenic environmental destruction. Co-authored by an indigenous leader and a French anthropologist and co-founder of an NGO defending Yanomami land rights, The Falling Sky is a first-person account of the life of a Brazilian shaman, activist, and spokesperson for the Yanomami of the Brazilian Amazon. It offers an expose of the environmental, demographic, and cultural catastrophe that Western resource exploitation has inflicted on the rainforest and its indigenous peoples. The Falling Sky advances an indigenous Amazonian cosmopolitical critique, that is to say, a critique assuming that cosmos and politics are inseparable, of Western greed and ecological ignorance. Probing deeper than environmental and social manifestations of the crisis, The Falling Sky traces its roots to the exploitive anthropocentric cosmovision of modernity. As the disastrous consequences of climate change are becoming ever more impossible to ignore, it is also becoming evident that success in preventing its worst effects will require nothing less than a paradigm shift in our modern outlook. Kopenawa and Albert's The Falling Sky presents an indigenous contribution to the contemporary search for a new social order organized around the principle of ecology. Its critique of Amazonian environmental destruction due to illegal gold mining, concept, the term being used is the smoke of gold, and rapacious capitalism, another neologism is the people of merchandise, dismantles modern reductive anthropocentrism to describe how humans and non-humans are bound into a larger functional whole. The Falling Sky engages one of the key concepts of ecology, the network concept of life, which states that all organisms, including humans, are interconnected with our species and the non-organic environment through mutual relationships. Kopenawa and Albert characterized the Yanomami Amazon as an ecosystem. Quote, "We are inhabitants of the forest, we are born in the middle of the ecology, and we grew up in it," end quote. Reflecting on differences between Western notions of nature and ecology, like from the Greek term oikos for household, they stress that better than nature, the concept of ecology, new in the West, actually captures a time-honored Yanomami understanding of reciprocal relations between humans and the world. The words of ecology, Kopenawa insists, are our ancient words, those Omama gave our ancestors at the beginning of time. The Falling Sky thus gives an unexpected turn to the lively discussion stimulated by Bruno Latour's pioneering critique of modernity and his subsequent efforts to rethink modernity as a networked ecological order. As Latour suggests, what is needed is the construction of an embedded alternative to the dominant dissociated modern social order. Beginning in We Have Never Been Modern and continuing in Politics of Nature, Latour outlines a new ecological outlook that dissolves the modern segregation of nature from society and gathers humans and non-humans into a common world. The Falling Skies claim that the words of ecology are our ancient words, quote, since the beginning of time, reverses the places assigned to the non-West and West in the modern developmental hierarchy and establishes the contemporaneity of Yanomami culture at our 21st century globalizing and climate-changed historical moment. As I will show, this reversal of developmental temporality is an integral part of a much more ambitious cosmological reconfiguration. It provides an alternative to anthropocentrism and to the anthropocentric teleological temporality of Christian apocalypse by upending familiar relations between past and present and natural world and humans, thus claiming vanguard status for people that, to borrow Latour's phrase, have never been modern. In an illuminating chapter on the falling sky in their recent study on the contemporary burst in apocalyptic writing, The Ends of the World, Brazilian writers Deborah Danowski and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro expand on its Amerindian version of what Latour terms political ecology. Quote, what we call environment is for them a society of societies, an international arena, cosmopolitea. There is therefore no absolute difference in status between society and environment, as if the first were the subject, quote unquote, and the second the object, end quote. As I will outline, Kopenawa and Albert develop a non-modern cosmovision of terrestrial life where Homo sapiens, rather than the pinnacle of evolution, is just one more living species in the web of life. Even more intriguing, humanity is not the exclusive property of sapiens, but a latent ancestral tendency of all beings. According to Danowski and Viveiros de Castro, the Yanomami's cosmovision replaces anthropocentrism with anthropomorphism, the idea that everything possesses some proto-humanity, quote, non-humans are seen as ex-humans that preserve a latent or secret human side. I find this fascinating, and I was just really thrilled as I discovered this book. So as I will argue, among the vital insights in The Falling Sky is the following provocative claim. In the debate over anthropogenic climate change and its projected consequences, any ontological approach to a new ecological order requires a return to images and storytelling, which is just another way of saying that it requires an embrace of myth. Even more important, The Falling Sky suggests that ecological thinking necessarily entails broader cosmological speculation, which in turn cannot do without some sense of grounding in a higher realm beyond the purely immanent world of everyday life. Specifically, the Amazonian forest ecology Kopenawa and Albert describe is also an enchanted world inhabited by spirits and forces that intervene into the human life world. The Falling Sky offers a political, ecological, and shamanic critique of modernity, and the central source of knowledge that Kopenawa draws on is not scientific, but religious, his shamanic visions. The centerpiece of the environmental imagination in The Falling Sky is Amerindian apocalyptic thinking, the Yanomami Amazonian myth of the falling sky. Religion is always, as we know, a difficult subject in the modern West because modernity is taken to be synonymous with secularism, commonly understood as the displacement of traditional religious worldviews by scientific rationalism. Contemporary environmentalism, for the most part, also sticks to secularism. The Falling Sky unsettles this view through an unfamiliar constellation of reason and unreason, where shamanic prophecy appears more rational than modern resource exploitation, and capitalist development more irrational than Yanomami ecological supernaturalism. The philosopher Charles Taylor is helpful for exploring a key problem posed by Kopenawa and Albert's book, the persistence of religious belief in a new form of contemporary culture. In his study, A Secular Age, Taylor argues that modernity is not equivalent to secularization, that is to say, the replacement with unbelief, but that it produces new forms of belief and unbelief. And now I'm going to move on to talking just about context for the Falling Sky. So before launching into a detailed discussion, however, we need to step back to review some important premises and contexts. Amazonia has long been the laboratory of iconic and competing images. The region's dense forest, essential to the planet's future, harbor its much-touted biodiversity. They are also the remote and inaccessible home of a great number of indigenous peoples, some of whom still elude the reach of modernity. The Amazonian world is endangered, threatening to collapse into chaos due to the centuries-long history of exploitation of Amazonia's natural resources and the brutal enslavement of its peoples by outsider invaders. The Amazon is thus both intensely local and thoroughly global. It is a node in a global network linking the Amazon to planetary flows and exchanges belonging to a great variety of systems, both material and non-material, ecological, economic, epidemiological, social, symbolic, and so on. Further, the organization of many of these networks is uneven and hierarchical. For example, the economics of resource extraction and modern development pits outsiders who profit against insiders who often lose. Thus, in the war of images over Amazonia, insider accounts of the Amazon contend with a global intention to the region that can seem overwhelming. Indigenous people struggling against this history of exploitation by outsiders face the additional challenge of dismantling the accompanying myths and false images of outsiders that complement the work of material destruction, such as the myth of El Dorado, or the myth of the white gold of rubber, or of the treasures of oil and precious metals, and so on. The Falling Sky recognizes that myths have been powerful vehicles of exploitation and conquest. Myths express a culture's fundamental beliefs about the relation between humans and the world. This is why effective resistance must also engage with the cultural imaginary. According to Albert, Davi Kopenawa began to formulate his, quote, shamanic prophecy about the smoke of gold, the death of the shamans, and the falling sky in the late 1980s, when the Yanomami territory, quote, was devastated by an unprecedented gold rush that plunged the region and its people into an epidemiological and ecological catastrophe, end quote. Kopenawa in Albert's book repurposes the Amazon's global interconnectedness into an instrument serving the cause of cultural and ecological survival and local self-determination. Among the many salient features of the Falling Sky is a flattening of the ethnographic power differential between outsider observer, global audience, and indigenous informant. The book is thus not the product of a white observer spying on indigenous culture. Indeed, the project was initiated by Davi Kopenawa, who is, quote, named as its first author, according to Albert in his preface, and it serves as a platform for an indigenous leader to address a national and global audience. And this is just showing a map here of the territory. So in the 1980s, Kopenawa was active in the campaign to defend Yanomami land rights that led to Brazil's 1992 legal recognition of Yanomami indigenous territory. Until the first contacts with whites in the early 20th century, the Yanomami had managed to remain mostly undisturbed forest dwellers in their remote territories on the upper Orinoco, Rio Branco, and Rio Negro rivers on the border with Venezuela in Roraima state. In the 1980s, the discovery of mineral wealth in the state prompted, quote, one of the most dramatic gold rushes of the 20th century that brought 40,000 illegal gold prospectors to the region, outnumbering the indigenous population 5-1 and leading to a 13% drop in the Yanomami population between 1987 and 1990. Amid the national and international attention to this epidemiological and ecological catastrophe, Kopenawa rose to prominence in the fight for Yanomami land and cultural rights. In the 1980s and 90s, he undertook several international trips as a Yanomami spokesperson. Since 2004, Kopenawa has served as the president of a newly founded Yanomami political organization representing the majority of Yanomami in Brazil. So the Falling Sky is therefore not about Yanomami, Amazonian Yanomami culture in the stereotypical mode of its subjection to the domination of an imperial gaze, in a term by, this is Mary Louise Pratt's term. Kopenawa initiated the book as a new tool in the Yanomami fight for cultural and territorial survival in the 21st century. The native is thus not the silenced other of Western discourse. To the contrary, the Falling Sky is a self-representation of indigenous ways of knowing and being that reclaims indigenous control over knowledge production, a procedure Maori researcher Linda Tuawai-Smith describes as decolonizing methodology. As Albert explains in an appendix to Kopenawa's on Kopenawa's kin, the Waturiki, Kopenawa's alliance with Albert mirrors Yanomami practices of what Donna Haraway terms making kin. And this is just, what I'm going to do now is just talk about different parts of the book. And so what I'm showing you here is actually the table of contents to see how, the kind of complicated and very idiosyncratic organization of this book. So An orphaned youth who gained experience with white culture working as an interpreter for Brazil's Indian agency, FUNAI, Kopenawa was adopted by Lurival, the preeminent doyen and shaman of Raturiki, as his disciple in shamanism and later as his father-in-law. Together, Lurival and Kopenawa elaborated a Yanomami cosmological and political interpretation of the white world's encroachment, one that proved very effective for defending Yanomami rights, to which Lurival contributed his shamanic knowledge and Kopenawa his knowledge of white culture. The subject of the book, The Shamanic Critique of White Modernity, of which The Falling Sky Prophecy forms the centerpiece, is thus the result of a cross-generational intellectual collaboration between two Yanomami leaders. When Kopenawa proposed the book project to Albert at the height of the gold rush in 1989, he effectively elected Albert, as he himself had been chosen by Lurival, for a second intersecting project with two authors. So the French ethnographer's task was to translate Kopenawa's Yanomami insider account of the epidemiological and ecological catastrophe in the Amazon for a global audience. As Albert recalls in the beginnings of the manuscript in his conclusion, entitled How the Book Was Written, quote, Davi Kopenawa decided to use a recording on 3 audio tapes to describe his views of the Yanomami tragic situation and to launch an appeal to me. And so he did in his own language, and the anguished tale of illness, death, violence, and destruction caused by the gold prospector's feverish greed. His account was interspersed with shamanic reflections that grew out of sessions with his father-in-law in Waturiki. Finally, he asked me to help him spread his message and to establish an emergency healthcare program among the Yanomami. The recording was the foundation of the political and literary pact that led to this book, end quote. Earlier, Albert also makes it clear that The Falling Sky is as much ethnography as a critique of the genre of ethnography. The ethnographer is not the observer who educates white readers about non-Western cultures. He's also re-educated by his informant, sealing an implicit solidarity pact, that's Albert's term, to bring the message to influence the outside world. Quote, while the ethnographer believes that he is gathering data, those who have accepted his presence are seeking to re-educate him as a truchman, I don't know how to pronounce this, truchman, intermediary in their cause, end quote. As Kopenawa affirms in his introduction, Words Given, the book and its global dissemination serve the interests of the Yanomami first and foremost. Addressing his French co-author, Kopenawa formulates his purpose thus, quote, I asked you to set my words on this paper in order to give them to the white people who will be willing to know their lines. Maybe then they will finally lend an ear to the inhabitants of the forest's words and start thinking about them in a more upright manner, end quote. As evident here, for Kopenawa, words are less about saying than about giving. To give words, is to pass on Yanomami teaching and wisdom, which are ancient, not new, original. Kopenawa is thus not the personal author of these teachings, which are, quote, the words of Omama and the Shapiri. They come from a very distant time, but they never die, end quote. Originating with the creation deity Omama, they are passed on through the lineage of shamans who gain their wisdom by communicating with the Shapiri, guardian spirits created by Omama, who are also the repositories of Omama's wisdom and words. As Kopenawa explains, they, quote, the words of Omama are very old, yet the shamans constantly renew them, end quote. The book Albert produces from Kopenawa's words thus becomes a new link in the lineage of ancient Yanomami wisdom, quote, I wish to offer white people these words and those of the Shapiri, which appear in the time of dream. Our ancestors had them since the beginning of time, end quote. At the same time, Kopenawa makes it very clear that the book's publication will not affect the Yanomami in any way. The Yanomami have nothing to learn from it, and its circulation or non-circulation will make no difference to who they are. To put it another way, I think it's a good way of thinking about The Falling Sky is like it's an indigenous work of world literature with kind of, so very sort of practical aims, goals of changing things in the world. And it's addressed to a cosmopolitan rather than to a native audience. As evidenced by its publishing outlets, Harvard University Press for the English translation, Librairie Poland for the French original, the purpose of this book is to educate an unknowing Western audience about the catastrophic consequences of hazardous modern trends. Its mission is to be heard in the West and around the world. So, we're doing the right thing talking about it here. To accomplish this, Kopenawa adopts a genre apocalyptic narrative and assumes a narrative voice, that of the apocalyptic prophet warning an unaware people, familiar to Western audiences. Apocalyptic thinking also happens to exist in Yanomami culture, in an independent way, and The Falling Sky produces a transculturated hybrid of the Western and Amazonian forms, bent in Tuawai Smith's terms to decolonial purposes. Kopenawa's goal is thus not to affirm an unbridgeable indigenous otherness, but to translate Yanomami concerns into words that command Western attention and recognition of indigenous people as legitimate stakeholders and authoritative spokespersons in the global public debate about the future of the planet. To do justice of the book's cross-cultural aims, this discussion of The Falling Sky borrows concepts from Western theories of modernity, such as Bruno Latour and Charles Taylor. The collaborative procedure of, I want to talk a little bit more about the collaborative, or the organization and the kind of the verbal, or the kind of the structure of the book. So the collaborative procedure of knowledge production also registers in the book's unorthodox and experimental form. Kopenawa's experimental autoethnographic narrative, which makes up the bulk of the book's close to 600 pages, is framed by 2 introductions and 2 conclusions. You see here how it's organized. At the beginning there's setting the scene and words given are the 2 introductions. At the very end, words of Omama and how this book was written are the 2 conclusions. And they're each written by one of the co-authors. So Words of Omama is written by Kopenawa. How this book was written is authored by Albert. Same thing. Setting the Scene is Albert's text. Words Given is Kopenawa's text. And the middle, these 4 parts, are in this voice I'm going to describe now in more detail. The inner first-person narrative is divided into 3 parts. The first is becoming other, and the first part focuses on Yanomami culture, history, and myth. The second part, entitled Metal Smoke, centers on contacts with the white world, while the third part entitled The Falling Sky, develops Kopenawa's eco-apocalyptic vision. The inner first-person narrative also unfolds in a different angle in 4 different registers, threading through all 3 parts. So on the one hand, there are chapters focusing on Kopenawa's personal life, and secondly, there are chapters recounting the collective history of the Yanomami. Third, there are chapters explaining traditional Yanomami cosmology. And fourth, there are chapters which detail Kopenawa's personal shamanic elaboration of these beliefs. So it's good to be aware of which chapter is headed in which direction. Toward the end, in part 3, the Kopenawa's personal elaboration of traditional Yanomami culture is clustered. Okay, so you're just slowly kind of getting educated into that kind of the actual message of the book, but you have to make it through hundreds and hundreds of pages first. So I don't know whether any of you are familiar with this work. So this is how it's done. So the book displays an enormous narrative and linguistic creativity. For one, it incorporates Kopenawa's neologisms that serves as central concepts of his shamanic critique of extractivist and profit-oriented modernity. The term concept, the concept of merchandise love for capitalism. Whites are the people of merchandise. The smoke of gold, or the metal smoke, are terms that refer to pollution generated by mineral extraction. The term earth eaters describes gold prospectors whose constant digging, it's like you see gold prospectors, they're constantly digging in the earth, makes them resemble peccaries. I think it's very funny. It's described to peccaries. And then the term cannibal gold refers to the lethal aggression that the gold rush unleashed on the people of the forest, just to name a few. Secondly, the book, quote, closely follows Davi Kopenawa's own wording and speaking style, as Albert just says, but renders it through a hybrid method of transcription. Albert describes this work as a, quote, translation that falls midway between a literal translation, which risked becoming a caricature, and a literary transposition that would have been too far from Yanomami language constructions. So as a result, the book is a kind of a hybrid first-person narrative that encompasses what Albert calls a double I, a hybrid composite of Kopenawa's speech on the one hand and Albert's translation and editing on the other. And it's something that Albert describes as a, quote, written / spoken textual duet. Super interesting. So playfully outlining the translation of identities occurring when, quote, two authors cohabit the same I, Albert explains, I became his alter ego by trying to bring out the richness of his thoughts, just as he committed himself to become mine through the trust he placed in my way of putting his words in writing, quote, end quote. In addition, Albert notes further perspectival splittings due to the heteroglossia embedded in Kopenawa's personal voice. Quote, the narrator's I is here inextricable from the we of traditions and group memory to which he is trying to give voice, end quote. Further, Kopenawa's father-in-law and shamanic mentor could also be considered as a co-author. Finally, and if we take into account the shamanic communication with the Shapiri spirits, quote, the I of Davi Kopenawa's account also embodies the voices of the many shamanic images of animal ancestors and cosmological beings. So there's a whole chorus out there in the first-person narrative, end quote. Kopenawa and Albert's multiple first-person narrative voice, as it were, is a vast echo chamber. Okay, so now I'm shifting to a third and central part of this talk, which is about the apocalyptic, sort of the meaning of the apocalyptic vision. So the falling sky. As noted earlier, the centerpiece of the falling sky's critique of Western modernity is the eponymous Amazonian myth of the end of the world. As Albert explains in his conclusion, the falling sky refers to a myth explaining the cataclysmic end of first humanity, which the Yanomami think prefigures the fate of our world, invaded by the deadly smoke of metals and fuels. Kopenawa's prophecy of the falling sky updates the ancient Yanomami myth of prehistoric apocalyptic world destruction to depict the consequences of Amazonian environmental destruction. And a synopsis of this falling sky of the prophecy of this, this is actually Kopenawa's original intellectual product, as it were. This prophecy is synopted as the epigraph, so appears as the epigraph to the book. And I'm just going to read that text. The forest is alive. It can only die if the white people persist in destroying it. If they succeed, the rivers will disappear underground, the soil will crumble, the trees will shrivel up, and the stones will crack in the heat. The dried up earth will become empty and silent. The Shapiri spirits who come down from the mountains to play on their mirrors in the forest will escape far away. Their shaman fathers will no longer be able to call them and make them dance to protect us. They will be powerless to repel the epidemic fumes which devour us. They will no longer be able to hold back the evil beings who will turn the forest to chaos. We will die one after the other, the white people as well as us. All the shamans will finally perish. Then, if none of them survive to hold it up, the sky will fall. Okay, the shamans are the last to go. So this is very interesting, and I'll explain why. So there's a lot to be said here, and a close reading of the multiple meanings and contexts of this passage will guide my argument in this last part of the talk. We should begin by noting the centrality of the rhetoric of if. If the white people, count the number of times if appears in this passage. If the white people succeed in destroying the forest, a series of disasters will occur until eventually the sky will fall. Analogous speculating about the catastrophic consequences of hazardous current environmental, technological, economic, and political trends is the definitive feature of contemporary environmental apocalyptic thinking. To appreciate the originality of Kopenawa and Albert's reconfiguration of eco-apocalypticism, a brief outline of its key arguments and historical markers is helpful, that is, of Western eco-apocalypticism, as well as of Western apocalyptic thinking more generally. So eco-apocalypticism, and this is like focusing on Western eco-apocalypticism at the moment for a minute, first arose in the 1960s when early environmental writers such as Rachel Carson seized on apocalyptic discourse as a powerful tool to alert the public to the looming environmental crisis. The 21st century, with beginnings in the late 1990s, has seen a burst of new apocalyptic narratives that focus on the so-called, often what's called the slow apocalypse of environmental catastrophe. Because in the Cold War, it was like there was also apocalyptic discourse, but it was like Cold War. It's like the fast apocalypse of the atomic bomb, right? We're all going to die in a second, but now it's a slow apocalypse, environmental catastrophe. Many works, such as, for instance, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is a hyper-canonical example, or Paolo Bacigalupi's The Shipbreaker, which is a young adult fiction example of apocalyptic literature, are so-called post-apocalyptic narratives of survival set in the immediate aftermath of environmental catastrophes due to climate change, mass extinctions, energy crisis, resource depletion, pollution, public health disasters, etc. Lethal plagues, but nonfiction, which dominated the early days of environmental apocalypticism, like Rachel Carson, for example, also still plays a significant part. For example, there's this interesting study by Alan Weissman entitled The World Without Us, which speculates about the future of the planet after the extinction of humans. So just a little bit more about the Western approach to environmental apocalypticism. So Octavia Butler and Margaret Atwood, two writers, authors of two of the most iconic works of contemporary eco-apocalyptic fiction, that is Octavia Butler's Parable series and Atwood's Mad Adam series, have insisted that their speculative fiction belongs to the category of speculative realism rather than the mode of the fantastic. In an interview, Octavia Butler invokes Robert Heinlein's, quote, 3 categories of science fiction stories: the what-if category, the only-if category, and the if-this-goes-on category as a frame of reference for a Parable series. So, quote, I like the idea, so this is definitely an if-this-goes-on story, end quote. Both Butler and Atwood stress that their post-apocalyptic works are a speculative variety of realist fiction. So it's realism, the base is realism, but it's a speculative variety of realism. So they are believable stories extrapolating the probable catastrophic consequences of present developments. And Atwood insists on this explicitly by saying that, Oryx and Crake, which is the volume 1, which a lot of you will know, is speculative fiction, not science fiction proper, which she views as a type of fantasy. So Atwood says, no, my trilogy contains no intergalactic space travel, no teleportation, no Martians. The what-if of Oryx and Crake is simply what if we continue down the road we're already on. So it's realism. Atwood's and Butler's insistence on eco-apocalyptic speculative realism is characteristic of the genre as a whole. To understand the full import of their rejection of the fantastic and the supernatural, and this is what's being rejected, the fantastic, the supernatural, we need to take another step back and consider the origins and form of apocalyptic thinking more generally. Apocalyptic thinking is a narrative about time that dates from antiquity. As suggested by the Greek roots of the term disclosure of knowledge, apocalyptic narrative reveals to an unaware audience the coming destruction of the world, a destruction that is total in scale. Ancient apocalypse is religious. In its Christian version, the Revelation of John, for example, its Christian version describes a future that is closed because its events are predetermined by God's will. In contrast to the modern notion of the future as open to change, as a matrix of open possibilities, the final days of the Christian apocalypse, when earthly time runs to a stop, are certain to arrive. It's very important. Contemporary environmental apocalyptic thinking, on the other hand, is secular rather than religious. And religion, according to Taylor's pragmatic definition, can be understood, quote, in terms of the distinction between transcendent and immanent as a mode in which the ultimate source of power is located outside the human life world in a transcendent realm. In contrast, secularity, according to a key definition modified by Taylor, it lops off transcendence and denies any higher forms, affirming a purely immanent order. Secularism pure imminence. So the shift from religious to secular environmental apocalypse results in a parallel change, and this is, this is very important, that environmental apocalyptic writing in the West is really secular, it's not religious, and that also changes the calculus of the coming world end. It's based on rational prognosis and not religious prophecy, and that makes a big difference, because while both foretell the future, the difference is crucial, as Reinhard Koselleck observes in his study on the temporality of modernity. While, quote, prophecy transgressed the bounds of calculable experience, prognosis remained within the dimensions of the political situation, end quote. So the wrath of earthquakes and plagues in the Christian apocalypse is beyond calculable experience. There's nothing you can do by thinking about it. You know it's going to happen. And the calculable, whereas in contrast, the calculable cataclysms of contemporary eco-apocalyptic thinking, in contrast, shift focus from the fulfillment of a divine plan to a secular forecast, so that even as both are projections of global destruction, they really suggest opposite modes of human preparation. Because whereas in the Christian variety entails a passive attitude of living in expectation of the unavoidable completion of providential design, environmental apocalypticism has an activist bent. Given the right kind of human intervention, the catastrophe can be mitigated or averted altogether. So it's really key to note this. In addition to shifting from religious to secular frameworks, environmental apocalypse also involves the turn to risk. As Ursula Heise has suggested, apocalyptic scenarios are, quote, a particular narrativization of risk perception because they construe a particular relation between present, future, and crisis. End quote. Risk communication depends on the use of realistic modes of language. Yet because absolute certainty is impossible in dealing with the secular future of risk, speculation necessarily takes the place of empirical description. Risk poses unique challenges to narrative. How, for example, does one describe the full reality of CO2 emissions, whose effects, such as the flooding of coastal cities due to rising ocean levels, won't manifest until decades to come? So we have CO2 levels in the air, and there's a certain tipping point that people talk about, like 1.5, you know the story, which according to some has been reached or has not been reached. So there's some level of predetermination already set, but it's not manifest yet. So this is really interesting. So how do you talk about something like this? The kind of virtual reality of something which is almost certain, but you can't see it. It's not palpable. So it's clearly a narrative challenge. It is evident that our climate-changed 21st century present is a multi-temporal node intersecting with catastrophic virtual futures that transcend empirical actuality but have to be taken into account because they're part of the present. For this reason, credible narratives about contemporary environmental crisis must include a dual temporality of manifest present and virtual futures. The plot structure of apocalyptic narrative is tailored to the particular challenges of novelizing risk. Apocalyptic narrative has a dual plot structure that is organized around the temporal oscillation between two levels of time, the pre-collapse present and the post-collapsed future. According to theologian Catherine Keller, apocalyptic thinking is defined by, quote, a script of binary time, a before and an after. Through its dual temporality connecting manifest presence to probable futures, eco-apocalyptic narrative presents a new speculative form of realism. Contemporary environmental apocalypticism discloses our own reality as a swollen present carrying the virtual seeds of yet-to-be-actualized future developments. Yet Kopenawa and Albert thoroughly defamiliarize and transform the tropes of risk scenarios characteristic of this environmental apocalypticism. So it's very important that, this is the shape of what I just talked about, is the shape of Western environmental apocalypticism. Now I'm going to shift to what Kopenawa and Albert do to that. So the falling sky myth is recounted in the first part. The present Earth is the back of a former sky, so-called Hutukara, which had collapsed and fallen onto Earth, or the forest, in the early stages of the world. The contemporary Yanomami are its inhabitants of the present Earth, also named Hutukara, for its pre-apocalyptic celestial ancestry. They belong to new species of humans created after the apocalypse of the collapse of the old sky. In the apocalypse, the historical fallen sky cataclysm, the inhabitants of the old earth were crushed and driven underground, where they transformed into monsters now populating the underworld. According to the book's multiple first-person narrator, quote, and this is, I'm just going to read this quotation here on the screen. So at the beginning, this is so in contrast, what's the difference between the passage I read earlier and the passage you're seeing here? The passage you read earlier, you saw earlier, is actually Kopenawa's shamanic prophecy. So this is like what may happen. What I'm reading now is actually his account of the historical falling sky prophecy. So there's two important, this is the precedent, which is accepted as already having happened, okay? So Kopenawa writes, at the beginning, the sky was new and fragile. The forest had barely come into existence and everything there easily returned to chaos. It was inhabited by other people who were created before us and have since disappeared. It was the beginning of time during which the ancestors changed into game one after another. And when the sky's center finally collapsed, many of them were hurled into the underworld. There they became I don't know how to pronounce this, Watapari, those sharp-toothed carnivorous ancestors. The back of the sky that fell in the beginning of time is now the forest where we live and the ground we walk on. This is why we call the forest Waru Patarima Mosi, the old sky, and the shamans also call it Hutukara, which is the name, this ancient celestial layer. So this is really interesting. So there's like, the sky's collapsed, and now the present Yanomami people are living on the back of the old sky, and the inhabitants of the former earth have been now living in the underworld. So this is sort of, So the book's central purpose is to explain why the ongoing destruction of the Amazon will trigger a recurrence of this ancient cataclysm. The collapse of the sky and the destruction and plunging of the present forest and its people into the underworld. As important, it insists that a second destruction of the world would be anthropogenic and not, and that human action or inaction is the decisive factor. The contemporary Yanomami are the new humans Omama, the creator deity, has fashioned to populate the new forest. Omama's work is partially foiled by his brother and dark counterpart, Yoesi, who introduces mortality to humans and who is depicted as the origin of all varieties of creatures and phenomena hostile to the Yanomami, extending from evil spirits to diseases to white people in general, and garimpeiros, which are illegal gold miners in particular. Yoesi's brood also includes the so-called shawara, is another Yanomami term, epidemic spirits, quote, eaters of human flesh, who also manifest as the deadly fumes produced by gold mining and other kinds of mineral extraction. So at the time of creation, Omama, and this is like the prehistory that, there's like, as I said, there's these four discourses are registered in the book, and one is the kind of the kind of Yanomami myth. And this is an account of Yanomami myth of how the world came to be and what happened till the present day. So at the time of creation, Omama also engenders the first shaman, his son. And he actually does so in the fold of his brother Yoesi's knee. Omama's son, who remains unnamed, is human like the Yanomami, but these, unlike the former, are descended from the heterosexual union of Omama and his wife, and Tue Yoma, the first woman. Tue Yoma is a transformed, quote, fish being that let itself be captured in the appearance of a woman, end quote. It is Omama's wife, Tue Yoma, who petitions Omama to create the Shapuri spirits to protect her human children from the evils visited upon them by Omama's sibling rival Yoesi. Upon reaching adulthood, Omama teaches his shaman son, quote, how to call the Shapuri spirits to heal his people, as well as the particulars of a sacred ritual of preparing and consuming the visionary medical Yokaana powder that reveals the Shapuri's voice, end quote. Umama's teaching culminate in formulating the shamanic mission in the cosmic order. Shamans are very important there, so because they're tasked to maintain the stability of the forest order and prevent it from collapsing into chaos, quote, hold up the sky so that it does not fall apart, end quote. They consult with the Shapiri spirits who, for their part, quote, also constantly work to prevent the forest from turning into chaos. So the purpose of shamanic practice, so it's not just some kind of, vision, religious, it's not just like prayer, but it actually has a real consequence, because the purpose of shamanic practice is to enlist the aid of the Shapiri spirits and together to maintain homeostasis in the cosmos. If they don't do it, everything falls apart. So the participation of humans is essential to maintain the cosmos, keep it going. So there are two important implications of this point, the first of which illuminates a crucial difference between the Christian apocalypse and in its Yanomami analog, the falling sky myth. It also spotlights the intellectual innovation of the falling sky's revision of Western environmental apocalypticism. First, unlike the biblical apocalypse, the future collapse of the sky, repeating the events of the first in ancient Yanomami memory, is not in any providential plan. When the narrative voice explains, we all, quote, we all fear being crushed by the falling sky the way our ancestors were in the beginning of time, end quote, the warning is different than the passive resignation to certain disaster instilled in readers of the Apocalypse of St. John, because it's going to happen no matter what. Whatever Christians do, nothing can prevent the apocalypse from happening. Kopenawa and Albert do not assert that the sky will fall. It will fall again. They warn that it may fall again. And a future cataclysm will occur only if humans refuse to play their part in maintaining balance in the cosmic order. Because Yanomami eco-apocalypticism does not entail accepting the inevitable, but is organized on the principle of risk. This is very modern. It's fully up to date, just like contemporary eco-apocalypticism, paralleling Western eco-apocalypticism in promoting human action or inaction as a key factor in deciding the outcome. Kopenawa's environmental repurposing of Yanomami myth reveals its astonishing timeliness compared to its deterministic Christian counterpart. The falling sky's non-determinism yokes together human agency on the one hand and the fate of the cosmos, something which is, I'm not a religious scholar, but I think that's pretty unimaginable in the Christian counterpart, that human action can actually decide the fate of the cosmos. The second point concerns the key difference in apocalyptic temporality. According to Judeo-Christian belief, there's only one Genesis and one apocalypse. When it arrives, the end of earthly history is final. Unlike its linear Western counterpart, Amerindian apocalypse is serial, and I find this fascinating, and I know that you've already talked a lot about this kind of serial apocalypses in Amerindian myth. As Danowski and Viveiros Castro observe, periodical apocalypses are the rule in Amerindian mythologies. Amerindian people were conscious of living on the ruins of a previous culture that had been destroyed. The Nawa, for example, thought of themselves as living in the fifth sun, a fifth world created after the destruction of the previous four. Because the cosmos had crumbled before, it could happen again. Custodial human action is needed to uphold the world. There is a different relation between the beginning of the world and its end. The teleological axis of Christian belief contrasts with the circular temporality of Amerindian myth. As we will see, this difference between teleology and circularity also organizes relations between humans and non-humans. The falling sky demonstrates that, paradoxically, the temporal structures of circular repetition of Yanomami myth, more than the modernizing era of time in logic of Western thought, are actually conducive to grasping the logic of ecological interdependence. So I find this interesting that, Western thinking is teleological forward, but I think it's sort of more circularity, circular reasoning, circular logic seems to be something that's important to ecological organization. So it's very interesting that, Amerindian myth is sort of connecting to that. To deepen the point about Yanomami cosmopolitical non-determinism above, the sacred cosmic order into which the Yanomami are set is imagined not as fixed and immutable, but as a fragile system existing on the brink of chaos. As Danowski and Viveiros de Castro note, Amerindian cosmologies imagine the present world as a stabilization of pre-cosmological time of transformations, where all beings were held in a state of ceaseless becoming other anatomically. Control is necessary because the world's transformative potential continues to be latent. The force system thus needs constant regulation to maintain equilibrium. In cybernetic terms, the force system is not self-balancing, but needs corrective action by internal steersmen. This is the task performed by supernatural agents, the Shapiri spirits, in cooperation with their human allies, the shamans. And this is a quote of another passage from The Falling Sky, which describes the process. So they, in other words, the Shapiri, consolidate the force when it becomes other and wants to transform itself. Without them, the plants in our gardens would not grow, the trees in our forest would not bear fruit, and the game would remain skeletal. The force would never stop having the value of hunger. They hold up the sky when it threatens to collapse, contain the thunder's anger, and send the rain being's daughters away, shut the storm winds in. They admonish the cloudy weather being and delay the nightfall being. They repel the night spirit and call the dew so that dawn breaks faster, end quote. Not only is the Yanomami cosmos imagined as an ecosystem of reciprocal relationships between many different species and forces, animals, humans, plants, etc., that need to be held in balance, its equilibrium is also maintained collaboratively, the Shapiri working together with shamans. In cybernetic terms, this is the balance is dynamic, that is to say, it's always in the danger of collapsing. That's Fließgleichgewicht. This is like the concept of so for Danowski and Viveiros de Castro, indigenous practice is regulated production. The aforementioned Yanomami claim to have been, quote, born in the middle of ecology is fully justified because you might say, I like to say, you might say that the Yanomami, instead of having cosmic harmony, which is pre-established and fixed, like the harmony of the spheres, the Yanomami has something like cosmic homeostasis, and then humans and they had to play a part to keep it stabilized. So the Amazonian forest is not pictured as a cliched pastoral harmony, but as a fragile ecosystem whose stability requires constant monitoring and regulation. In the West, the science of ecology introduced the concept of an ecological community as an assemblage of organisms bound into a functional whole by their mutual relationship. This is sort of difference between societies and ecosystems. So where societies are collectives of the same species, there's human societies, there's animal societies, ecosystems are webs of organisms belonging to many different species. So, and the Yanomami do not live in a human society exclusive to humans. They live in a multi-species ecological collective. And so that's also why they're not non-modern in Latour's sense, because they're outside this sort of nature-culture dichotomy. Having established vanguard credentials for its non-modern organic, that is to say, existing since time out of mind cosmology, and seated the Yanomami in our yet-to-be-realized ecological future, The Falling Sky doubles down on its challenge. Kopenawa's environmental apocalypticism further breaks the bound of the secular and reserves a place for religious belief. The Yanomami have not participated in what Charles Taylor describes as the modern shift from cosmos to universe, that is to say, from a meaningful totality of existence that embeds human life in a transcendent realm to an immanent structure limited to physical forms only. To distinguish the Yanomami cosmos from the modern concept of the universe, Danowski and De Castro coined the term relational multiverse to describe the living forest housing societies of many species. A relational multiverse. This Yanomami hybrid supernatural naturalism, you might say, or natural supernaturalism, is expressed in the opening statement of the epigraph, which I quoted at the beginning of the section, "The forest is alive." It says the forest is alive. Yanomami ecology is set in an enchanted world where the supernatural is as real as ordinary reality, at least for shamans. The Yanomami, who are something like the Yanomami dedicated minority of religious virtuosi, which is like Weber's term for a special caste of religious people like priests and monks are like that, religious virtuosi, they're like virtuosi. The Yanomami thus expand the multi-species ecological collective to include the transcendent realm of supernatural beings, most centrally the Shapiri, the Yanomami protector spirits. So let's talk a little bit more about the Shapiri, something approximating a supernatural keystone species in the Yanomami ecosystem. The Shapiri obtain their centrality from their ancestral lineage. According to the first-person narrator, quote, the Shapiri are the images of the Yarori ancestors who turned into animals at the beginning of time, end quote. Images are, quote, the real center, the real heart of animals, end quote, something like souls, but visible, hence the term. They're called images and not souls, though only to the shamans and not to ordinary people. The Yarori are in turn are the mythical first people of the pre-apocalyptic, pre-cosmological time of transformations. The Yarori are an instance of ancestral beings found in many Amerindian myths, which Danowski and Veras de Castro describe as unstable anthropomorphs who, quote, were not fully unstable anthropomorphs who were, quote, were not fully human in the sense that we are, since despite having the same mental faculties as us, they possessed great anatomical plasticity and a certain penchant for immoral conduct such as incest and cannibalism. After a series of exploits, some groups of this primordial humankind progressively morphed, either spontaneously or due to the actions of a demiurge, into the biological species, geographical features, meteorological phenomena, and celestial bodies that comprise the present cosmos. On De Castro and Danowski's account, Amazonian cultures, indeed Amerindian cultures more generally, are anthropomorphic rather than anthropocentric. Like anthropocentrism, Amazonian anthropomorphism is founded on an ancestral argument. For the Yanomami, we are not the only humans because everything was human at some time. So anthropomorphism and the assertion of the latent ancestral humanity of all beings is the most impactful dimension of Kopenawa and Albert's contribution to environmental thought and eco-apocalypticism in particular. As they maintain, here's the quotation, in the beginning of time, animals were as humans as we are. They are not different. Today we give ourselves the names of humans, but we are the same as they are. This is why in their eyes we still belong to their kind. End quote. Rather than conceiving humans as descending from animal origins, the Yanomami conceive of animals as metamorphosed proto-humans. For the Yanomami, the origins of animals are human, as I say, as they say. At first we are part of the same people. End quote. In the anthropocentric view, animals belong to the past and humans own the future. And Danowski and Veras de Castro describe Yanomami anthropomorphism as a kind of multiple aversion of Western anthropocentrism, as they outline in Amerindian thought. Humankind or personhood is both the seed and the primordial ground or background of the world. Homo sapiens is not the character who comes to crown the great chain of being by adding a new ontological layer, spiritual or cognitive in moral parlance, on top of a previously existing organic layer that would in turn have emerged out of the substrate of dead matter. End quote. In short, the Yanomami really undo human exceptionalism. And not only that, they actually make it unthinkable. So a larger picture emerges in which, what is this? Okay, something wrong here. Okay, no, this is good. A larger picture emerges in which contemporary humans and animals are related by triangulation with two other mythic beings, their common ancestors, the proto-human Yarori and the Sapuri spirits. As Kopenawa and Albert go on to explain, and this is another quotation you see on the screen, the images we bring down and make dance as Sapuri are the Yarori's form of ghosts. They are their real hearts and true inner parts, and so these animal ancestors from the beginning of time have not disappeared. They have become the game that lives in the forest, but their ghosts continue to exist. They still have their animal names, but they're now invisible beings. They have transformed themselves into the Shapiri, who are immortal, end quote. So The ancestral anthropomorphs no longer exist physically except as their descendants, full-fledged animals, humans and other elements in the forest, but their humanity, like their soul, still exists in the form of these spirits, the shapiri, their images, because they can be seen, but only by the shamans. As we have seen earlier, the shapiri spirits are the shamans' partners in maintaining homeostasis in the forest. The spirit shamans communicate with are thus the souls of the first people, the unstable anthropomorphs from whose differentiation all beings in the present are descended. Viveros de Castro has coined the term Amerindian perspectivism to design this broadly shared notion in indigenous America, according to which each existing species sees itself as anatomically and culturally human, since what it sees of itself is its soul, that is an internal image that is like a shadow or echo of the ancestral humanoid background common to all beings. And so for this kind of weird, almost incomprehensible sense of humanity as the essence of all living beings, the Danowski and Viveros de Castro have this sort of great, found this great characterization. They say that there is an animal for the Yanomami, there is an animal unconscious, and the animal unconscious is humanity. So it's like the precise inversion of our kind of ideas. Consistent with these views, Kopenawa and Albert's critique of Western extractivism and capitalism builds its case on the charge of violating the principle of anthropomorphism and cosmic homeostasis. The chapter on merchandise love dissects materialism and capitalist accumulation. For the Yanomami, it is dangerous for humans to accumulate too many artifacts that do not decompose because they disturb the balance of the forest. In Kopenawa and Albert's words, quote, merchandise does not die. This is why we do not accumulate it in our lifetime, end quote. For the Yanomami, whites are the purple of merchandise because merchandise makes them euphoric and obscures all the rest of their mind, end quote. The cause of devastation of the Amazon, mineral extractivism can be understood as one of the manifestations of, quote, this great term coined by Albert and Kopenawa, merchandise love, because it extends the euphoria of accumulation to mineral deposits in the subsoil. Here's a quotation. Omama buried the minerals so they would stay underground and never be able to contaminate us. Yet in their ignorance, the white people started frenetically tearing the minerals out of the ground to cook them in their factories. They do not know that by killing them this way, they liberate the evil vapor of their breath. It rises in all the directions of the sky until it hits its chest. Then it falls back on the humans, and this is how it ends up making us sick, end quote. Indeed, extractivist greed has been the defining constant in white attitudes toward the forest, from the rubber bonanza in the Amazon in the 19th century to the gold rush of the 1980s, which brought the gold prospecting earth eaters in Kopenawa's wonderful image. So as Kopenawa reflects, quote, the white people have always been the same since long before my birth. They always wanted to tear rubber, pear nuts, massy vines, and jaguar skins out of the forest like they wanted to find gold in it today. Their avidity was what has made most of our elders die long ago. I just have a few more details here on some of these things. The difference between Yanomami subsistence farming and hunter-gathering from white extractivist attitudes is summed up in this pithy formulation, quote, unlike the white people, we do not eat the forest and its earth, we feed on its game, its fish, the fruit of its trees, end quote. And there's an important difference Kopenawa establishes between destructive predation, which is eating, and sustainable consumption, which he uses the term feeding on. And that's a really fertile area of creative concept mongering in the falling sky. To begin with, sustainable feeding of the Yanomami entails treading on thin ice because given the latent anthropomorphism of animals, eating other life forms, as all humans must, all animals must, is a form of cannibalism and is therefore placed under strict regulation. According to Viveiros de Castro and cannibalism, those who are familiar with, like Brazilian, Amazonian, it's very interesting, like this cannibal metaphor in Amazonian thought. So cannibalism is an omnipresent motif in Amerindian world, according to Brazilian anthropologist Viveiros de Castro. This circumstance discloses the full intended weight of denunciation underlying the epithet cannibal gold. Albert's endnotes to the first-person narrative elucidate the chain of associations that link evil because devouring forces, beginning with the lethal epidemics brought by missionaries during first contact and extending to present pollution due to metal, mineral, and gold extraction. The following remark exemplifies this analogy between various agents of predation. The Shawarari epidemic beings live in houses overflowing with merchandise and food like gold prospector camps. This is where they cook the people of the forest's flesh. Remains of the cannibal meals hang everywhere in their homes. End quote. So the Shawarari epidemic beings are evil spirits, the maleficent variety of magic forces populating the enchanted Yanomami forest, who are the Shapari's adversaries, manifest in the guise of various material phenomena, such as, from epidemics to quote metal smoke. They embody the essence of destruction and therefore evil in the same way that the Shapari embody the essence of life and goodness. As Kopenawa and Albert observe, quote, now we know where those evil fumes come from. It is the metal smoke, which we also call the mineral smoke. They are one and the same, Shawara epidemic smoke, and it is truly our enemy. Dark magic must be kept in check by white magic, and the Shapari attended by shamans balance and contain destabilizing forces, these evil beings that threaten to turn the forest into chaos. So building on the modern concept of nature and ecology are secular ideas. The forest, the third term, the falling sky proposes as the Yanomami substitute for the former two, that is nature and ecology, is not. It's not a secular idea. And that Kopenawa puts a great deal of weight on this point, stating that whites, quote, think that the forest is dead and empty, that nature is there for no reason, and that it is mute, end quote. Whites people find nature beautiful without knowing why. On the contrary, we know that what they call nature is the forest, and as well as the Shapari who live in it. So it's an enchanted ecology. The Yanomami forest extends beyond the limits of the immanent world of human and non-human interaction and opens out onto a higher transcendent realm. In eco-critical terms, the falling sky's outlook might be classified as deep ecological, because in contrast to shallow ecology, which is human-centered, deep ecology, quote, does not separate humans from the natural environment, according to the standard definition. Yanomami anthropomorphism, or the view that humans are not the only beings who possess mind, further radicalizes deep ecology. And so the Yanomami political ecology forges deeper ties of cross-species mutualism than is conceivable in secular Western environmentalism. So, yeah, just a couple more pages and it should come to an end to wind up. So Charles Taylor's, and I just want to put this in perspective by sort of against the foil of Charles Taylor's theory of Western modernity. Charles Taylor's theory of Western modernity illuminates the striking originality of what we might call the falling sky's enchanted ecology. Charles Taylor conceives of modernization as a shift between two ideas of moral order. From a pre-modern order, then a pre-modern order is the order of hierarchical complementarity. The modern order is the order of mutual benefit between individuals. And so there's a change that, the change is that the pre-modern order begins with a whole to which it subordinates the parts, such as individuals, whereas the modern equivalent begins with the parts to which it subordinates the whole. And so the pre-modern cosmos is held to be God-given and organic, and expressed in the nature of things, and the pre-modern order is self-realizing, meaning it's just there. Whereas the modern order, according to Taylor, is always the work of reform. It's something that was deliberately changed and brought about by humans. It didn't just exist. So modern society is a human artifact. It's never just, just pre-exists. It's a modern society in the sort of Western sense is a human artifact to be perfected in the service of human welfare. also, this is sort of the origin of the idea of the justification of revolutions, because this work of reform justifies revolutionary upheavals if society has reached a point which is damaging and needs to be changed. So we have the modern concept of revolution. So central to our purposes, the pre-modern social order is also an enchanted world grounded in a higher cosmic time and governed by divine beings with powers to intervene in human affairs. And in contrast, the key feature of Western modernity is the progress of disenchantment, as we all know, the eclipse of the world of magic forces. And so on Taylor's account of the process of modernization, disenchantment is made possible by the even more fundamental process of disembedding, which is like the part-whole thing. You take the individuals out of the context of the whole and reverse the whole relationship between parts and whole. And sort of the idea of detaching the human agent from the social and cosmic order, which started like in the so-called axial revolution thousands of years ago. So now, what about indigenous modernity against this foil? So as a formation of indigenous modernity, Kopenawa and Albert's The Falling Sky philosophy actually innovates on this process because the Yanomami Enchanted ecology combines central features of the pre-modern and modern orders. So from the pre-modern order, obviously it takes the enchanted cosmos, the idea of notion of humans as porous agents, and the notion of humans as porous agents embedded in a higher time, transcending everyday life, depending on the powers of the Shapuri spirits, and also an organic cosmos designed by deity, or Mama. From the modern order, on the other hand, it takes the idea of heightened power of human agency and responsibility in effecting the order of the whole, which is not possible in the sort of standard notion of pre-modern. Like the individual doesn't even have the power to do anything about the cosmic order. So this is really important. That and so I think that's why the whole Falling Sky prophecy is a really fundamentally modern thing, because it gives the central agency to humans in sort of stabilizing the cosmos. So, and then the final point is about where the shoulders that all of this rests on are the shamans. And so this is, at the end we should have take another look at the role of shamans. As the Falling Sky prophecy quoted at the beginning of this last section of my talk shows, the interspecies diplomacy in the ecological detective is a task performed by shamans. According to Viveros de Castro's ethnographic account of Amazonian culture, shamanism can be understood as a kind of cosmopolitical diplomacy. I like this. This is really fun. So cosmopolitical diplomacy, whose purpose is to cultivate good eco-political relations with the spirits and through them with other species. As de Castro observes, quote, on account of their capacity to see other species as the humans that these species see themselves, Amazonian shamans play the role of cosmopolitical diplomats in an arena where diverse sociocultural interests are forced to confront each other, end quote. So in the Falling Sky, when shamans are dreaming the forest, they are visited by the Shapuri spirits who begin to dance for them and who in return expect their shaman patron to settle them in a spirit house built to house them on their visits. And Kopenawa and Albert actually use the analogy of the United Nations. There's something like, each shaman has a kind of spirit house where the Shapiri live, and this house will be truly huge like the United Nations building, okay? So it's just for us to understand what this means. So it's on account of the shaman's role as diplomatic intermediaries in convoking assemblies in the forest multiverse arena, that in the series of cataclysms preceding the Yanomami apocalypse, the death of shamans is actually a crucial final step. It's only if the shamans die, other humans die, will not have so much consequence. But if shamans die, that's when the skull will fly, because they play a central role in homeostasis, this kind of supernatural homeostasis. So the end of the world and of humanity will arrive after the death of all shamans, which breaks the chain of, because that breaks the chain of communication between earthly and otherworldly spheres. Kopenawa and Albert predict that as long as they're, quote, as long as their shamans alive, their Shapuri will be able to quiet the sky when it threatens to come apart and hold back its fall. But if all the shamans die, the sky will break apart for good, and no one will be able to do anything. So last comment here is the creator deity Omama tells the first shaman, quote, "Hold up the sky so it does not fall apart." It is this message that Kopenawa passes on to his global audience, quote, "There's only one sky and we must take care of it, for if it becomes sick, everything will come to an end," end quote. But there's a follow-up to the falling sky prophecy of eco-apocalyptic collapse, because they say after that, it may be that in a very long time, other people will come into being where we once existed, but they will certainly be other inhabitants of the forest and other outsiders. So there may be, new people alive in the future. So in this circular and this is all an instant of like the circular temporality of Amerindian apocalypse. We are not the last, and there'll be other suns coming after us. In the circular temporality of Amerindian apocalypse, a new beginning is possible after the world end, and eventually a sixth sun or a seventh may come about after contemporary, using the Nawa term, after contemporary humanity has destroyed the fifth. So, as I hope I have shown, the falling sky challenges the temporal vector of Euro-American eco-apocalypticism. Instead of the teleological axis of anthropogenic temporality, the emergence of Homo sapiens as the pinnacle evolution, it refers us to a temporality of a terrestrial life where Homo sapiens is just one more living species in the web of life. So thank you for listening. Come to an end. Thank you for attention. Sorry.